The cattle baron lost a bet in a saloon and gained a wife the same night. I'll tell you about the worst night of my life, which turned out to be the best. I'd been drinking since 4 o'clock. Not drunk. I don't get drunk the way other men do. I just get quieter, and quieter ain't always good for me. Quieter means I stop arguing with the voice inside my head that says things I'd rather not hear. That night the voice was saying, 53 years old, 12,000 acres, 300 head, a house with 9 rooms and not a single one of them warm. The saloon in Harlan's Crossing wasn't much. Pressed tin ceiling, floorboards warped from a flood 4 years prior, a mirror behind the bar with a crack running diagonal that split every man's face in two when he looked at it. I'd been in that saloon 200 times if I'd been in once, and I knew the crack in that mirror better than I knew my own face in daylight. The left half of your face looked tired. The right half looked like it was about to say something it would regret. I'd ridden in from the North Range that afternoon. Spent the morning trying to track 3 steers that had pushed through a downed fence section in the dark, found 2 of them, couldn't find the third, and rode in at noon with mud to the knee and a bad feeling about the third steer that I couldn't shake. Sometimes you just know. 15 years working cattle teaches you the difference between an animal that's lost and an animal that's gone. I knew before I stopped looking. That's the kind of day that puts a man in a saloon at 4 o'clock. Not weakness, just the arithmetic of accumulated loss. The steer was $400 on the hoof. The fence repair would take 2 days and materials I'd have to send to tellers for. And the deeper thing, the thing the whiskey was for, was the ride back to a house with 9 rooms and 1 lamp burning in the window. The lamp I'd learned to leave burning because coming home to a dark house was worse. Walt Dempsey started the whole business. Walt was a land speculator out of Cheyenne, soft around the middle, always smelling of bay rum and bad intentions. He'd been buying rounds since noon, which meant he wanted something. Men like Walt always want something, and they loosen the room up with whiskey first, the way a man greases a hinge before he tries to force a door. He sat down across from me around 7. Outside, the wind had come up off the plains and was pushing grit under the door. I could feel it on the back of my hand, fine as flour. "Harlan," he said. He called me Harlan because my name's Harlan Cade, and he thought using a man's first name made them feel like friends. It didn't. I said nothing. "Cards," he said. I said nothing again, but I didn't get up, which he took as a yes, and that was my first mistake of the evening. We played for 20 minutes. I won 2 hands, lost 3, won 1 big. Walt won 1 big. The room was watching, the way rooms always watch when there's money on the table and they don't have any skin in it themselves. The barkeep, a man named Orville who had the resigned look of a man who had witnessed every variety of human foolishness and expected to witness more, kept filling glasses without being asked. There were maybe a dozen men in the room, some I knew, some I didn't. A couple of the faces at the far table were new drovers maybe, passing through, the kind of men who attach to a place only long enough to spend their wages and move on. I'd been one of those men once before the land claimed me, before I'd built the first room of that house. It was Walt who suggested the last hand. 1 hand, he said. High card, face down, flip at the same time. Stakes of his choosing. I should have walked. 12,000 acres didn't get built by a man who took gambles he hadn't already figured the odds on. But the whiskey had made me quiet, and quiet men make poor decisions in saloons, and I said, "What stakes?" Walt smiled. He had small teeth, very white, and too many of them somehow. He leaned back and looked toward the bar, toward the far end of it, and I followed his eyes, and that was the first time I saw her. She was standing at the end of the bar with a glass of water, not whiskey, water, and she was looking at the mirror with the crack in it, and she wasn't looking at herself the way women usually do when they catch their reflection. She was looking at it like she was thinking about something else entirely, and the mirror just happened to be in the way. Dark hair pinned up but not carefully, some of it loose at her neck. A coat that had been good once, brown wool, the collar turned up. She wasn't young, 35, maybe 38, and she wasn't soft the way some men want women to be soft. She had the look of someone who had been through weather and come out the other side still standing. I noticed her boots first, before her face. Trail-worn, resoled at least once, practical. The boots of someone who had been walking a long time towards something and hadn't gotten there yet. Walt said, "The deed to the south quarter of your pasture land, 1,500 acres against," and he nodded toward the woman. The room got quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. I said, "That's not a stake, that's a person." Walt said, "She's my niece, widowed 6 months back. I'm her legal guardian until she remarries, such as it is, and I'd like to see her settled." I said, "You'd like to gamble her like a horse." Walt said, "I'd like to see her settled," is what I said. The woman at the end of the bar had not turned around. She was still looking at the cracked mirror, or past it, and I thought either she couldn't hear us or she'd heard and was making a choice about whether to look, and the making of that choice told me something about her I couldn't quite name yet. Most women in her position would have made a sound, turned, protested, done something to show they were a person and not a parcel. She didn't. She stood absolutely still and waited, like someone who has learned that the best information comes to those who keep quiet. I should have gotten up and walked out. I should have told Walt Dempsey he was a sorry excuse for a man and left him with his white teeth and his bay rum and his bad intentions. I've thought about that moment 1,000 times since. The hand I didn't put down on the table, the chair I didn't push back. Instead I said, "One condition." Walt said, "Name it." I said, "She agrees to this." The room shifted. Walt's smile thinned. He hadn't expected that. Men like Walt never expect to be asked about the other person's consent because they've arranged the world so that consent is a thing they provide on behalf of other people. One of the drovers at the far table made a sound, not quite a laugh, just a sound that meant, "Huh." I turned in my chair and I said, loud enough to carry, "Ma'am, I'd like to speak with you a moment if you're willing." She turned then. She had gray eyes, not pale gray, dark gray, the color of sky before rain, and she looked at me without any particular expression on her face, which was more unnerving than if she'd looked annoyed or afraid or anything at all. She walked over. She moved like someone who had learned not to hurry because hurrying told people they had power over you. She carried her glass of water with her. She didn't set it down. She stood at the end of the table and she looked at Walt and she looked at me and she said, "I heard." I said, "Your uncle wants to stake you in a card game." She said, "I know what my uncle wants." I said, "Do you agree to it?" She looked at me for a long moment, not at Walt, at me, and I had the unsettling feeling of being looked at the way I looked at horses I was considering buying, not unkindly, but without sentiment, with an eye for what was real. She said, "If I lose, do I go to you?" I said, "That's the arrangement as Walt has laid it out. But I'd add that you'd have your own room and your own say, and I'd no more force anything on you than I'd force a door that wasn't mine to open." She said, "And if you lose?" I said, 1,500 acres of the best pasture in the county goes to your uncle, and I go home and sleep it off." She was quiet for a moment. The saloon had stopped breathing. Even Orville behind the bar had stopped what he was doing with the glass in his hand and was just holding it. Outside, the wind pushed at the door and something in the ceiling, some loose piece of the tin, ticked once and went quiet. In moments like that you become very aware of small things, the taste of the whiskey still at the back of my throat, the way the lamplight made everything amber and a little unreal, the fact that my heart was doing something it hadn't done in 8 years. She said, "You've got kind eyes for a gambling man." I said, "I don't gamble as a rule. Tonight was a lapse in judgment." She almost smiled, not quite. She said, "All right." Walt produced a deck, fresh, still slick. He fanned it across the table face down and looked at me and looked at her and said, "Ladies first." She reached out and drew a card without hesitating, the way you reach for something you've already decided on. She set it face down on the table in front of her, and she folded her hands and looked at Walt with those gray eyes and waited. I reached into the spread and pulled a card, didn't look at it, set it down. Walt said, "Together." She flipped hers. Queen of Spades. I flipped mine. The room made a sound. Jack of Diamonds. Walt leaned back. He picked up his drink. He had the decency, barely, not to smile, but I could see he was working at keeping his face still. I looked at my card for a moment. The Jack looked back up at me, that flat painted face with its two profiles and its sword, and I thought, well, there it is. I thought of the steer that morning, the one I couldn't find. The fence still down. The 9 rooms. The voice inside that gets louder when I get quieter. All of it sitting there like weight on a scale, and now 1,500 acres about to tip to the other side. I looked up at the woman. She was looking at me. Not at Walt, not at the cards, not at the room. At me. I said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let that stand as a bet in the first place. You go wherever you'd like. You're not obliged to go anywhere on account of a card game." She said, "What's your name?" I said, "Harlan Cade." She said, "I'm Clara Voss." I said, "Mrs. Voss." She said, "Clara." What I said earlier, about your eyes. I said, "I remember." She said, "I meant it." And then she said, and this is the part I've turned over more times than I can count, lying awake in that big empty house with the wind off the planes coming under the eaves, she said, "I've been standing at that bar for 2 hours watching men be men in the way men usually are, and when you said you'd no more force a door that wasn't yours to open, I thought, there's a man who knows the difference between owning something and earning something. So I'll go to your ranch, Mr. Cade, if the offer still stands. Not because a card says I have to, because I'm choosing to." Walt looked like he'd swallowed something he hadn't ordered. I said, "The offer stands." Orville set down the glass he'd been holding. One of the drovers at the far table said something quiet to the other one, and the other one nodded. That was all. Men don't make a production of things that matter. They just nod. I paid my tab and I stood and I put on my coat, and Clara Voss picked up a traveling bag from beside the bar that I hadn't even noticed. She'd had it there the whole time, which told me she'd made this decision before I ever opened my mouth, or before the bet was even laid, or maybe she'd been making it the whole 2 hours she stood at that bar with her glass of water watching men be men, and she walked with me out into the night. The wind hit us as soon as we cleared the door. Cold, grit in it, smelling of sage and dry creek bed. My horse was tied at the post, and she looked at the horse and looked at me, and I said I'd hire a rig from the livery, and she said she'd ridden double before if I didn't mind, and I said I didn't mind. I helped her up first. She settled herself, and then I put my foot in the iron and swung up behind her and took the reins, and we set off down the main street of Harlan's Crossing, past the hardware, past the shuttered bank, past the church with its lamp still on, out to the road north. Behind us the saloon was doing whatever saloons do after a thing like that happens, going back to itself, the noise closing over like water over a thrown stone, nobody marking it for long. But the two of us were out in the night, and the road was silver with starlight ahead of us. We didn't talk much riding out to the ranch. The stars were extraordinary that night, the way they only get when the wind clears everything out and the sky goes from dark blue to black to something that doesn't have a name. She sat behind me with her hands at my sides, not holding on hard, just present, and I could feel the warmth of her through my coat. The horse moved steady. The road was good for a mile and then got rough where the wagon ruts dried wrong in the fall, and she moved with the horse without complaint, without stiffening up the way someone unused to riding will. She just moved with it. At some point she said to the back of my head, "Quiet, what's the ranch called?" I said, "The Cade place, never named it anything else." She said, "How long?" I said, "I've been there 15 years, bought the original section, added to it piece by piece, built the house in the 3rd year." She said, "Big house?" I said, 9 rooms. She didn't say anything to that, but I felt something in how she held herself change slightly, not loosening, not tightening, just adjusting, the way a person adjusts to new information. The ranch house came up out of the dark, the windows unlit except for the one lamp I'd left burning in the front room. 9 rooms. I'd built every one of them, mostly with my own hands and Pete's, adding a room when I thought there'd be someone to fill it, and then building the next one when I needed something to do with the hope that kept accumulating whether I wanted it to or not. I tied the horse and showed her to the door and lit the lamps inside, and the house came up around us, big through the front room, the kitchen at the back, the hallway with its doors. She stood in the front room for a moment and turned around slowly, not performing admiration, just taking stock, the way you'd survey land before making a decision about it. I showed her the kitchen and showed her a room at the end of the hall with a window that faced east. I said, "Yours." The room had a bed I'd made myself, solid, walnut, a dresser that had come over from my wife's family, and that I'd never moved because moving it felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make, and a hook on the back of the door and a braided rug on the floor that I'd bought from a Ute woman at the trading post 3 years back. It was a decent room. It got the morning light. She set her bag on the bed and looked around at the room in the lamplight, and she said, "It's a good house." I said, "It's been quiet." She said, "I know something about quiet." I made coffee because it was the only thing I knew how to do at that hour, and it was something to do with my hands, and she sat at the kitchen table and I sat across from her, and we drank it without saying much. The stove was warm. The lamp on the table threw a circle of light between us. Outside the wind had come up again, pushing at the west window, but inside it was still and warm. I couldn't remember the last time the kitchen had felt warm at night. I'd kept the stove going all winter, some winters, and the room was warm enough, but it had been the warmth of a stove, which is different from the warmth of a room, the difference being another person in it. She said, "How long have you been alone?" I said, 8 years. My wife passed in '84. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Your husband?" She said, 6 months. Fever. We were in Dakota Territory. He had a homestead claim, 160 acres in a valley that got good summer grass but was murder in winter. He came down sick in February and was gone by March. There wasn't anything to stay for once he was gone. I said, "And Walt?" She said, "Walt is my husband's cousin, not my blood. He offered to help me get settled, and what he meant was he'd sell me off to the highest bidder. He arranged something with a man in Laramie 2 months back, a man I'd never met, and I refused, and he tried again in Casper with a rancher who was 68 years old and had buried 2 wives and was looking for a third to do his cooking. Tonight was the 3rd time. I said, "Why'd you agree to this one?" She looked at her coffee cup. She turned it in her hands the way you turn something you're thinking about, slow, feeling the weight of it. Then she looked up and she said, "Because you asked me first." I said nothing. She said, "The other 2 men Walt arranged, they never looked at me once. They talked to Walt about me like I was a parcel he was shipping. You stopped the whole thing and you turned around and you asked me. That was the whole of it. That was enough." I said, "That's not much to stake a life on." She said, "It's more than most women get." I thought about that for a while. The coffee got cold. The stove ticked. The wind found some gap somewhere in the north wall and made a low sound, not unpleasant, just the house talking to the weather the way houses do. I said, "I want to be straight with you about what I am. I'm 53 years old. I'm not charming. I work from before sunup until after dark most days because this ranch doesn't run itself, and I've never learned to let other men do what I can do myself, which my foreman tells me is a character flaw he has mostly stopped trying to correct. I've got 12,000 acres and 300 head, and more money than I know what to do with, and the truth is I eat most of my meals standing up because sitting down at a table alone in a big house feels." I stopped. I pushed the cup to one side. I said, "I built this house for a family, and the family didn't come and I kept adding rooms anyway. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I built the rooms the rest would follow. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How many rooms?" I said 9. She looked around at the kitchen, at the good lamp and the solid walls and the window facing west where the stars were still up. She said, "That's a lot of rooms for one man." I said, "It is." She said, "I'm a fair cook. Better than fair, truthfully. My mother was half Shoshone and she taught me to cook with whatever the land gave you, and the land generally gave more than people expected if you paid attention. I don't mind hard work. I have my own opinions and I'll tell you what they are, and I expect the same in return. I won't be invisible and I won't be an ornament. I've been a widow for 6 months and I've been treated like something left behind by somebody else, and I am tired of it. Tired of being managed and arranged and spoken about instead of spoken to." I said, "I wouldn't know how to treat a person like that. I run a ranch. Everybody here pulls their weight or finds somewhere else to be. I don't talk about people behind their back. I say what I mean to their face. I expect the same." She said, "Then we'll get on." And that was that. We sat there until the lamp burned low and outside the wind finally quit, and the quiet that came after it was a different kind of quiet from the quiet I'd been living in for 8 years. Full rather than empty. Like the difference between a barn with no animals and a barn in winter with the horses in their stalls. All that warmth and breathing in the dark. I noticed it, noticed the quality of the silence, the way you'd notice the absence of a sound that's been bothering you for a long time. I said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and I went to bed, and I lay awake for a long time listening to the house, which sounded different already with another person in it. She was up before me. That was the first surprise. I came out at 5:30 and there was coffee made, and she was standing at the east window in the kitchen watching the light come up, her hands wrapped around her cup, her hair still loose, and she turned when she heard me and she said, "Your east pasture. What's wrong with it?" I said, "What do you mean, wrong with it?" She said, "The grass on the north end is a different color from the rest. I could see it when the light came up just now. Either something's been at the water or the ground's turned alkali." I looked at her. She said, "I told you. My husband had a homestead in Dakota. I know grass." I said, "I'll check it today." She said, "I'll come." And she did. She rode alongside me on a mare I let her pick from the remuda. She walked down the line and looked at each horse without touching them, and then she put her hand on the gray with the white stocking and said, "This one." And the gray was the best of the lot, which told me something about her eye. We rode out to the north end of the east pasture in the early morning cold, and she was right. Alkali seep. Coming up slow from underground, been going on for a season at least. The soil where the grass thinned had a pale crust on it, faint but unmistakable, and when I dug my boot heel in the smell that came up was wrong. My foreman, Pete Salinas, was already out there when we rode up. He'd been with me 11 years, and he was one of those men who says very little but misses nothing. He looked at Clara and looked at me with an expression that was many things at once, and was none of them for long. I said, "Pete, this is Clara Voss. She's going to be staying on." Pete said, "Morning, ma'am." Clara said, "The seep is running back about 20 yards from the fence line, the way the salt shows. If you dig a drainage cut on the diagonal, you can redirect the water table runoff north before it reaches the root zone. I've seen it done. Works if you do it before the next hard freeze." Pete looked at her, then he looked at me. I gave him nothing. He looked back at her and he said, "How diagonal exactly?" And she told him, sketching it in the air with her finger, the angle and the depth and where to run the cut down to low ground. Pete listened the way Pete listens to things that are worth listening to, which is without comment, head slightly tilted, like a man tuning a watch. When she was done, he looked at the north end of the pasture, and then he looked at me and he said, "I'll get 2 men on it this afternoon." That was Pete's highest endorsement of anything. That afternoon, I rode the full fence line on the south quarter, while 2 of my hands dug Clara's drainage cut. I was thinking about the 1,500 acres I'd almost lost. 1,500 acres I'd bought piece by piece from a family called Dunmore who'd been broken by 3 bad winters in a row. And that ground was some of the best. I had thick grass on the high end, good water access from the creek, shelter from the north wind in that fold of land just south of the tree line. I'd staked it against a card game, because I was quiet and alone, and a man named Walt Dempsey sat down across from me. That's what the voice inside gets you, when you stop arguing with it. I rode back to the house at dusk, and she had supper on. Not elaborate beans and salt pork and cornbread that was better than anything I'd made in 8 years, and we ate at the table, and she asked about the South Quarter, and I told her about the Dunmores and the 3 bad winters, and she said, "Some land is cursed by the people who struggled on it, and some land is just land. Which is it?" I said, "Just land, it's good ground. The Dunmores weren't ranchers by nature, they farmed. The land needed cattle and got corn." She said, "And before them?" I said, "Before them it was open range. Buffalo some years when the herds still came through. Before that I don't know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Something to think about, who the land remembers." I didn't know what to do with that exactly, but I set it aside and carried it with me the way you carry something you don't have a place for yet. On the 3rd day she fixed the hinge on the smokehouse door without telling anyone she was going to do it. I came around the south side of the barn at noon, and there she was, kneeling in the dirt with my toolbox open beside her and the hinge pin in her hand, her coat off despite the cold, her sleeves pushed up. The door had been dragging for 2 months. I'd been meaning to fix it for 2 months, and there were always 30 other things. She heard me behind her and said, without looking up, "The wood swelled. You need a longer pin or the hinge moved." It moved. I said I was going to get to that. She said, "I know, now you don't have to." I stood there a moment, and then I went back to what I'd been doing. I don't know why that hinge stays with me the way it does. Bigger things have happened since. But there's something about a person who just does a thing that needs doing, quietly, without making an announcement of it, that goes straight to whatever part of a man has been waiting to be seen. On the 4th day she looked at my accounts. I'd left them out on the desk, not for her. I'd been working on them that morning before riding out and hadn't put them away. When I came back at midday she was in the kitchen, and the accounts were back on the desk, but something about the way they were stacked told me she'd looked at them. I didn't say anything. She brought me coffee and said, "You're paying too much for feed grain out of tellers." I said, "I've been buying from tellers for 6 years." She said, "There's a mill in Cravens that'll do the same quality grain at 2/3 the price if you buy in seasonal bulk. I priced it when my husband was still alive. We were looking for a winter supply and got as far as writing to them before it didn't matter anymore. The letter's still in my bag. You can have it." I sat down at the desk and looked at the accounts with that information in them, and the difference it made was not small. I said, "Cravens is 40 miles. She said, "It's 40 miles twice a year for a wagon pickup. The rest of the time it's less money." I said, "I'll write to them." She said, "I already did. This morning when I found paper. I hope that's all right." I looked at her. She said, "If it isn't, tell me and I won't do it again." I said, "It's all right." It was more than all right, but I didn't say that. On the 6th day Walt Dempsey came. I was in the yard when I heard the horse. Walt came up the lane with that too easy way he sat a saddle, like a man performing the act of riding rather than actually doing it. He stopped at the gate and looked at the house and then looked at me. He was wearing his good coat, the one with the fur collar, and his hat was new. He'd put on his best for this. He said, "She's still here." I said, "She is." He said, "I want to speak with her." I said, "You're welcome to ask her." He didn't like that. He said, "Harlan, I'm her guardian. I have a legal right to." I said, "Walt." She told me what the other arrangements were, Laramie and Casper both. She told me what you wanted for her and what she thought of it. She's here because she chose to come here. You ride off my land now, quiet, and I'll let it end there. Push further and I'll have a conversation with the county clerk about guardianship papers and what they actually say and what a man can and can't do with them." He looked at me for a long moment. He had his white teeth and his bay rum and his bad intentions, and none of them were any good to him here on my land in the morning light with 12,000 acres at my back and Pete watching from the barn door. He said something under his breath that I didn't catch and didn't try to, and he turned his horse, not in any hurry. He was too proud to hurry, and he rode back down the lane. Clara was standing in the doorway of the house. She'd been there the whole time. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You don't need to thank me for that." She said, "I know, I'm thanking you anyway." She went back inside. I heard the stove and the sound of something being said on the counter, the clank of a pot, small domestic sounds of a house that's being used the way it's supposed to be used. I stood in the yard for a moment with the sun on the back of my neck and I thought, 9 rooms. I built 9 rooms. Pete came out of the barn and walked over to me and stood beside me the way Pete stands, easy, not making a thing of it. He looked down the empty lane. He said, "She write that letter to Craven's?" I said she did. Pete said, "Woman knows her grain prices." I said she does. Pete said, "Drainage cuts working. North end of the east pasture already looks different." I said I saw. Pete said nothing else, which was Pete's way of saying a great deal. The second week settled into a shape I hadn't expected, which is to say it settled into a shape at all. My life had been shapeless for a long time in the way that work fills every hour and yet leaves nothing particular in it. Same tasks, same light, same silence. Clara brought edges to the days. Not in a way that chafed, I'd half expected that. A woman with opinions in a house with a man set in his habits, but in a way that made each day's edges visible, so you could see where one ended and the next began. She rose before me every morning. That was the first edge. I came down to coffee already made and the east window light already accounted for, and there was something in that, in having someone else already present, already moving through the world, that pulled me up and into the day differently than I'd been going into days for 8 years. On Monday of the second week, she asked me about the Northridge section. I said, "What about it?" She said, "It's not on the map you showed me, the one over the desk." I said, "It's not officially part of the deeded land. It's open range. I run some cattle up there in summer, the grass is good through July." She said, "What does the ridge look like from up top?" I said, "What do you mean look like?" She said, "From high ground, what do you see?" I thought about it. I said, "The whole valley, both branches of the creek. On a clear day you can see the mountains north must be 60 miles. She said, "I'd like to see that." So on Tuesday morning we rode up to the North Ridge. It took 2 hours in the cold, up through the timber where the light came sideways through the pines, and the snow still lay in the deep shadow places though it had melted on the open slopes. The horses moved well in the cold. The gray she'd picked handled the timber better than I expected, sure-footed, not nervous on the narrow trail, smart about where it put its feet. I made note of that. When we came out of the trees onto the high open ground above the ridge line, she pulled up. We sat there on horseback in the cold wind and looked out over it all. It was a clear morning. You could see everything she'd asked about and then further, the valley's green-brown shape, the 2 silver branches of the creek catching the light, the big pastures laid out below like a map of something I'd been building without knowing exactly what it would look like when I stood above it. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "It's a real thing, isn't it, what you've built?" I said, "I suppose it is." She said, "My husband's claim in Dakota was 160 acres of mostly flat ground and a sod house with a dirt floor. He was proud of it. He should have been. He'd broken that ground himself with a team and a single-bottom plow, and it was his. But standing up here," she paused, "standing up here you see what land can become, when somebody understands it." I said, "The land taught me. I mostly listened." She turned to look at me. The wind was in her hair, and her cheeks were red from the cold, and she looked real in the way that people only look when they're outside, and the wind is honest with them. She said, "That's the thing about you, Harlan Cade." I said, "What thing?" She said, "Most men want to own land. They talk about what they've done to it. You talk about what it's taught you. That's different." I didn't have anything to say to that. I looked out over the valley and felt the truth of it pressing on me, which is how truth tends to land, not loud, just present and unavoidable. We rode back down at noon. In the afternoon, I worked the herd on the south section, and she joined Pete at the barn. And when I came in at dusk, Pete told me she'd helped him work out a rotation schedule for the east pasture that would keep the seep area from being overgrazed through the recovery. He'd drawn it up on paper, and she'd amended it twice. He held up the paper to show me, and the handwriting changed partway down the page, Pete's big careful script, and then her smaller, precise hand taking over. I said, "She's all right." Pete said, "She's better than all right." Coming from Pete, that was close to extraordinary. On Thursday of the second week, I had to ride into Harlan's Crossing for a meeting with the county assessor about the South Quarter property lines, a surveying dispute I'd been arguing for 2 years. I asked Clara if she wanted to come. She said yes, and she dressed for it, the brown coat and good boots and her hair properly pinned, and we rode in together. I noticed the town notice us. I noticed because it wasn't subtle. Heads turned. Not unfriendly. Harlan's Crossing knew me. I'd been part of it for 15 years, but registering, accounting, placing her. I heard my name said once behind me on the sidewalk, and I kept walking. The meeting with the assessor took an hour and a half. Clara sat in the outer office, and when I came out she had been talking with the assessor's clerk, a young woman named Prout who had ambitions of leaving Harlan's Crossing and going to teach in Denver, and who found in Clara, apparently, someone worth talking to. They had their heads together over something on the desk. Clara looked up when I came out and stood and said, "How did it go?" I said, "Well enough." She said, "The survey line." I said, "They're sending a man in spring, probably goes my way." She nodded. On the way out the door, the young clerk Prout said, "Mrs. Cade," and Clara paused. She hadn't been called that before. I hadn't given it to her. We weren't married yet in any formal sense. It was just the town assuming the shape of things from how we'd come in together. She paused and she looked at the young woman and she said, "Yes." And then she walked out the door beside me, and we went down the steps into the afternoon cold, and she didn't say anything about it, and I didn't either. But there was something in the way she'd said yes that had settled something. We stopped at the dry goods and she bought thread, dark blue, and a length of flannel she said was for curtains for the east room, her room. I paid for it. She let me. That was new too. It wasn't until the end of the second week that anything was said about what we were to each other. We hadn't named it. I told her she had her room and her say, and I'd held to that, and she'd held to whatever she was holding to, and we'd worked alongside each other and eaten together and talked in the evenings, about the ranch, about weather and water and grass and animals, sometimes about other things, memories mostly, the way people talk when they're getting used to the sound of each other. And I was aware, in a way I hadn't been aware of anything in a long time, of her presence in the house. She was cooking something different every night. Not fancy. She used what was in the larder, and what came from the kitchen garden she'd started digging in the south corner of the yard, even though the ground was half frozen, but the variety of it surprised me. 8 years of eating the same 4 things, and suddenly there were tastes I couldn't name. I asked her once what a particular seasoning was, and she said something in a language I didn't know. And then she said her mother's word for a plant that grew wild in the hills, and she said, "Your west field has some. I'll show you." And she did the next morning, walked me out to the place on the west field where the gray-green plant grew in a clump near the rock shelf, and she crouched down and took a leaf and held it out for me to smell. It smelled like the inside of something old and good and specific, like a place you've been that you can't quite name. She said, "My mother said every plant has a use. You just have to know what it's for." I said, "What's this one for?" She said, "Food. And also for cold in the chest. And also," she paused, "also my mother said it was for remembering. You burn a little of the dried leaf and it helps you remember what you need to and forget what you don't." I said, "I could use some of that." She looked at me. She said, "What would you want to forget?" I said, "Nothing anymore." She stood up. She was close. We were both crouched over the plant, and when she stood, we were close, and she looked at me for a moment in that direct gray way, and then she said, "I'll dry some of the leaves. For winter." That was as close as we got to saying anything, for another few days. It was a Wednesday that things shifted. I'd had a hard day, a fence lying down on the west quarter, 3 steers out, one of them in a draw with a bad leg that we had to put down. Same draw where I'd lost the steer on the night I went to the saloon. I found him, finally, 3 weeks late, and it wasn't what I hoped. By the time I came in, I was tired in a way that goes deeper than muscle. The kind of tired that's been accumulating for years and just picks one day to make itself known. Everything heavy. The steer and the fence and the years and the sound my own footsteps made on the porch. She'd made supper. She'd made it and kept it warm, and she didn't say anything about how late it was or what had kept me. She set the plate in front of me and sat across the table and let me eat in silence. She had the rare quality, in a person, of not filling silence with noise just because it was there. After a while she said, "The steer." I said, "Had to put him down." She nodded. She understood that what it cost, the plain flat weight of it. You'd have to have worked land and animals to understand it without being told. The loss isn't just money. It's an animal you knew, and the admission that you couldn't find him in time, and the sound of the thing. I said, 8 years is a long time to run a place alone." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't mean the work. I can do the work, I mean." I stopped. I looked at my plate. She said quietly, "I know what you mean." I said, "Clara, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the honest truth and not the polite answer." She said, "All right." I said, "Are you staying because you don't have anywhere else to go, or are you staying because you want to be here?" She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was between us, and the light was good, and I could see her clearly. She had a small scar on her left jaw that I'd noticed the first week but hadn't asked about. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me in the saloon, that dark gray steadiness, no performance in it. She said, "I've had somewhere else to go since the 3rd day. The schoolhouse in Harlan's Crossing needs a teacher, I was told when I went to town for the grain letter. I could have gone and set myself up there and been independent within a month. I thought about it." I said, "Why didn't you?" She said, "Because on the 3rd day I watched you stand in the east pasture at 7 in the morning in the cold and do the work of figuring out what was wrong with your own land that you should have caught 2 months ago, and you didn't blame anyone. You just got out your knife and dug up a piece of sod and looked at it and said, 'There it is.' And I thought, that's a man who knows the difference between a problem and a failure. Most men can't tell the difference. They turn every problem into a failure, and then they find someone else to put it on." I said nothing. She said, "And then on the 6th day you stood in the yard and you sent Walt away, and you did it without raising your voice, without posturing, without making a display of strength for my benefit. You said what needed saying, and that was all. Like it was a thing that needed doing, and you did it. End of story." She reached across the table and she put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm and the skin of it was roughened from work, same as mine, and the gesture was simple and direct, no uncertainty in it, the way she did everything. She said, "I'm staying because I want to be here, Harlan. I'm staying because you're the first man in longer than I want to think about who treated me like I was worth asking, not worth arranging, not worth settling, worth asking." I looked at her hand on mine, and I looked at her face, and I thought about that crack in the mirror in the saloon, how it split every man's face in two, the tired half in the half that was about to say something, and I thought, this is the thing the tired half has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. This exact thing. I turned my hand over and held hers. I said, I've been thinking about asking the circuit preacher to come out when he passes through next month. She said I'd say yes to that. I said you don't have to. She said, Harlan, I know I don't have to. I just told you I'm here because I want to try to keep up. I laughed. I don't laugh easily, and I hadn't in a while, and it came out a little rough, like a door that hasn't been opened in some time, and she smiled at the sound of it. A real smile, the first full one I'd seen from her, the kind that changes a face entirely, and that smile, I'll carry it as long as I carry anything. Longer, maybe. The preacher came through on a Thursday in the third week. He was a small, dry man named Alcott who had married more couples than he could count and buried more than that, and had the look of someone who had made peace with the full range of human experience and found it mostly tolerable. He had a good handshake and cold eyes that warmed quickly once he'd taken your measure, and he took mine in about 30 seconds and Clara's in 10. He married us in the kitchen with Pete Salinas and a hand named Dell as witnesses, and it took about 8 minutes. And when it was done, Alcott said, May you each be what the other needs, which is about as good a blessing as a man can get and better than most. Afterward, Clara produced a cake. She'd been accumulating ingredients in the pantry without telling me, the molasses, the dried fruit she'd traded a jar of preserves for in town, the good flour she'd ordered in the grain supply, and the kitchen smelled of it all afternoon. Pete ate 2 pieces and shook my hand without saying anything, which from Pete was the equivalent of a speech. Dell was more forthcoming, he said. Mr. Cade, if you don't mind me saying, you look like a man who found something he didn't know he was looking for, and I said, I don't mind you saying it, Dell. That was the truth of it. That evening, after the preacher had moved on and Pete and Dell had gone back to the bunkhouse, Clara and I sat on the porch in the dark. The stars were up again, that same enormous sky as the night I'd brought her out from the saloon, the Milky Way laid across it like something poured out. The plains were quiet and wide and cold and smelled of sage. The kitchen garden she'd started in the south corner of the yard was a dark rectangle against the ground, already mounded and waiting for spring. She'd planted things in it before the freeze, root vegetables that would go in deep and come up in March. Planting for spring when it was still winter. That told you something about how she thought. She was beside me on the bench, her shoulder against mine, and I could feel her breathing, the warmth of her through the wool of her coat. After a while she said, 9 rooms. I said 9 rooms. She said, we'll fill them. I put my arm around her and she leaned into me, just leaned, easy and natural. The way water finds the low place, not because it's forced but because it fits, and we sat there on that porch in the dark with the whole ranch spread out before us. The pastures and the fences. The east field already showing better color than it had in 2 years. The barn with the lamp still on inside where the horses were settling in for the night. All of it. All 12,000 acres of it under the same sky, same as it always was, but different from the inside. There's men who spend their whole lives being counted out. Too old, too set, too worn down by what the years have done to them. And sometimes what looks like the worst night of your life, a bad bet in a saloon, a jack of diamonds when you needed a king, turns out to be the night a woman with gray eyes and a good wool coat looks at you straight and says, You asked me first. That was enough. I've been enough for her, and she's been more than enough for me. And the rooms are filling.